So now you have presumably completed the April 20th Group A and Group B participation questions. You were asked 4 questions about these different groups and your impressions of them and their average members based on those different slides that you saw. Just giving you a single behavior about a bunch of different members of those groups. So why did I have you do that? Well, this hopefully is going to approximate something about how we come to believe things about different groups. One of many ways that we come to believe things about these different groups. So what I did was I showed you a bunch of things, obviously, about Group A and Group B, and they weren't totally random. They were, formulated in some way to get you to perhaps think something about each of these different groups. And the kind of interesting thing about those sentiments that I showed you were that they actually were very balanced between Group A and Group B. There were 18 positive statements about Group A members and 8 negative statements, and 9 positive statements about Group B members and 4 negative statements. So there were twice as many statements about Group A, but twice as many positive and twice as many negative. So within each of these groups, Group A to Group B, the ratio of positive to negative statements was the same. It was 9 statements that were positive to 4 statements that were negative. It's just that you saw more of the positive statements for Group A. So how does this actually have anything to do with how we form stereotypes? Well, there is a concept called an illusory correlation that's useful to know about. This is when we think that there's a relationship between 2 variables, between, a skin color and a trait, for example, or a religion and a behavior. And we believe that there's some sort of relationship there when there really isn't one, or maybe there's not as strong a one as we believe. So it's you getting a false impression that 2 different things are related when they're actually not. And the way that this happens is sometimes we usually tend to notice distinctive things when they're paired together. So in those things I showed you, there's Group A and Group B. Group B is distinctive because there were fewer of them. Group A was the minority, or sorry, I said that wrong. There are Group A and Group B. Group B was more distinctive because it was the minority group. There were twice as many Group A members as Group B members. There were also fewer negative events. The negative events were distinctive because there were fewer. Just like in real life, on average, people are engaging in positive or benign behaviors a lot more often than they're engaging in really negative, especially publicly visible negative behaviors. So negative things are distinctive, just like in this demonstration. So we tend to notice those distinctive things when they're paired together. So Group B members and negative things, even though there were only 4 of them, you probably remember those more, or they were more impactful on your perceptions of those different group members. And this happens with other types of things too, relatively neutral things like, oh man, it always rains and ruins my weekend, or it always rains right after I wash the car, and it ruins that effort I put forth there, or phone always rings when you're in the shower. This used to be something that people cared about more when, people actually used phone calls and we didn't have, constant ways to get in touch with people. Or things like groups of people that might be positive, like doctors being wealthy, for example. Because doctors are distinctive, they're in the minority, and wealthy people are distinctive, they're in the minority. These things cause problems, though, for groups that are disadvantaged in some way. So groups like African Americans being stereotyped as criminal, it's not necessarily the case, of course, that people are in minority groups are criminals. It's that we tend to notice associations between numerically smaller groups and numerically rare behaviors, like being a criminal. So people tend to associate these things more strongly because when they see them in minority groups, then it tends to be that kind of distinct pairing. So this hopefully is helping to illustrate just one of the many, many reasons that we might develop negative stereotypes about people or develop prejudice associations against people in minority groups. That we're noticing these distinctive things about distinctive groups, and negative things have a tendency to be distinctive, unfortunately, leading to types of stigma that happen here. And this does, tend to be borne out in the evidence in how people perceive the, rates of crime across different races. People tend to think that the arrest rate for African Americans is way higher than it actually is. And that leads to all sorts of negative outcomes when you are assuming negative things about an entire group of people. Then they might be discriminated against in many other ways, even outside of a law enforcement context. So we're going to talk a lot more about this stuff, but this is one very simple cognitive explanation for why these prejudice attitudes might develop. And I've done this before where I've looked at the data from, this group A and group B activity, and overwhelmingly people tend to, about a 2-to-1 margin, people tend to select group A for having the more positive traits and group B for having the more negative traits. And I bet when I look at all of yours, you'll probably have done the same thing. Not because you are bad, cold-hearted people, but because of the way you are, cognitively adapted to kind of pair those distinctive things together. We talked about the naturalistic fallacy in this class before, that what is true is not necessarily what ought to be true. So some of the things that our brains have a tendency to do are just that they're natural, but that doesn't mean that they're good, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to work against those sorts of things, work against our programming, so to speak. Okay, so I said we were going to go through these different three types or three components of the negative attitudes about other groups: stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So we're going to start with stereotypes. The definition we'll use for that here will be a set of beliefs about the attributes shared by a group of people. So this could be, any types of traits or characteristics or behavioral tendencies that have to do with, anyone belonging to a religious group or ethnic group or gender group or sexual minority or whatever it happens to be. Stereotypes, it's a concept that's been around for a very long time. For over 100 years, we've been talking about beliefs about groups in this way. They have been called the pictures in our heads, like the types of prototypes or exemplars that come to mind for us when we think about somebody from a particular group or from a particular country or that has a particular job. But pictures of of what? What are the things that are coming to mind when, we talk about stereotypes? The probably simplest and most straightforward way of thinking about how stereotypes actually are constructed and how they function is to think about something we've already talked about at length. So when we were in the social cognition unit, we talked about schemas. These were, if you remember, just the way we organize knowledge in an associative way in our minds. We have these different networks of information where like concepts or related concepts are tied together by different levels of associations, and that activation of those concepts can spread to other like concepts. So we get these things from, the media, culture, how we've grown up, our direct experience, things we've heard from other people, and they tend to be overwhelmingly shared within cultures because we frequently have similar sources for this type of information. And that's true of all kinds of things like, what it's like to go to a restaurant and what bank has good rates, or what school is known as a party school or something. Like we have shared understandings of what these things are like. This tends to get applied to people too, however, though, because of the different associations that we have with different identities and different groups of people. But just how we would organize information in a schema for ourselves or for some more neutral concept, we do this for groups too, groups of people. And we might associate some concepts very tightly with those groups of people that become very easily activated when that group comes to mind. Like, for example, here, if you have some random group called Group A, maybe you really strongly associate them with the traits of being intelligent, intimidating, and deceitful. But there might be other things that we associate with them more weakly or more distally. Like maybe we also think Group A is violent, hardworking, and funny. But those maybe aren't the first things that come to mind for you, but they're still involved in that schema. Maybe more weakly associated, but still associated. So these inner traits might be things that come to mind very quickly and easily. These other ones maybe require a little more activation or even some deliberation and conscious thinking to bring them to mind. But these schemas about people function in exactly the same way schemas about anything else function. Like your schema for grass bringing to mind green, lawnmower, lawn, that same set of functions brings about these types of traits when you're thinking about any particular group. So these pictures in our heads, pictures of what I said earlier, what are these pictures? They're, again, of people of any type of group. Any type of label that you have a conceptualization of, you have some kind of stereotype. And it goes beyond things like black or white or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Serbian, Mexican, people from, any other particular place. They are things like the different jobs that we have, or the type of person you think somebody is, or the values that they have. If you have a conceptualization of some identity or some group marker, then you also have some kind of stereotype about it. You have a set of traits or tendencies that come to mind when you think of people that have those ideas. And sometimes we might express these things in ways that are a little unexpected. So, for example, there's a burgeoning area of research using Google searches and Google Trends to show that people, might not always be telling the truth about things, and people have a tendency to tell Google, metaphorically, things that they wouldn't tell their spouse or their therapist or their priest. And people type in, all sorts of personal and also horrible things into Google, and you can see sometimes the stereotypes that people have if you type in some sorts of stems of questions into Google. Sometimes it's hard to get Google to actually do this anymore because I think they've recognized that some of the things that auto-populate are offensive, and people from those groups type them in sometimes, and that is, not an ideal scenario for people to have to be faced with those things all the time. So if you type this in, for example, right now, these things don't come up, but they used to. If you just type in things about different groups, it shows you like popular searches and things that people have said frequently. Now, this isn't the type of data that people are using in research. This is just kind of a curiosity more than anything. But if people, you can download things from Google that show like varying by region how much people are searching a particular term, and you can actually get measures of like stereotypes and racism that are arguably just as accurate or more accurate than survey data just by looking at what people are Googling, because people sometimes don't want to tell people that are doing surveys or answering an online survey something that looks bad for them, but people will Google racist jokes and racial epithets, and that's maybe more indicative of what they actually think about different groups than the number they circle on a survey or something. So again, these things are, they're on people's minds. They're expressed in sometimes unexpected ways, and they often have, relatively negative content that we might not always, want to believe that other people believe, or maybe not even want to believe that we believe it ourselves. Stereotypes and the prejudice and discrimination that come with them can be very uncomfortable to reckon with. But that, it's important that we don't deny that these things are happening so that we can grapple with them and try to reduce their impacts, particularly on disadvantaged groups. A really important concept for how stereotypes get activated and applied to people, something called categorization, and it is, basically what it sounds like. We tend to put people into boxes, basically. And in the contemporary world that we live in, we are particularly likely to put people into 3 different types of boxes. Boxes based on race, boxes based on gender, and boxes based on age. I say in the contemporary era because, as we're going to talk about later, the way that we have evolved and adapted as human beings wasn't always in tune to all 3 of these things. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but the way that we categorize people is, in part socially constructed. And that social construction has to do with the historical and cultural environment that we're in. But anyway, just like we can look at an object and be able to quickly and flexibly categorize it into door, window, house, shelf. We can see these things, and it's not hard for us to categorize objects like that. We categorize people in much the same way along these socially important types of dimensions. And just like the more prototypical a table is when you see it, it's more easy for you to categorize it as a table. The more somebody fits a prototype you have of a particular group, the faster you're able to categorize someone into that particular group. So it is easier, for example, for people to categorize people with very dark skin as African than people with, let's say, lighter or a medium skin tone, because for many people, an African person has darker skin. The same way that if you were trying to categorize somebody as a man or a woman, there are particular traits that we associate with masculinity and femininity that allow you to categorize a person as a man or a woman. You'll notice again that just underline the fact that these traits these boxes are socially constructed. Race is not a biological truth. It is a social construction that we have based on all sorts of historical and cultural things going on. Gender also is a set of social roles that we have put onto the 2 most common biological sexes, but not everyone fits into one of those biological sexes, and even more people don't identify with the biological sex to which they're born. So again, these things are socially constructed ways that we put people into boxes that aren't always diagnostic of how they live or how they feel or how they think. But these things, being able to categorize things, objects, people, whatever, tends to be useful for us to navigate the social world. And it tends to be, right more often than it's wrong. It's just that when it is wrong, it can have poor consequences for the people that we're categorizing. This is an important, adaptive process for us to engage in, though. It's so much so that it is something that we do automatically. We don't think about it. Of course, you can think about, yes, that is a woman, that is a person with X skin tone that I associate with X race or whatever, but you don't need to think about it in order to categorize people. Categorization happens automatically, that you notice those types of attributes and you have placed that person in that box, so to speak, in your brain already. A line of work that really showed some important things about how this process works was conducted by Patricia Devine, a researcher who at the time and still is at the University of Wisconsin, does awesome work with stereotyping and prejudice. When you work in the stereotyping and prejudice field and read this type of stuff, you say words like awesome work or exciting work or cool work, and I don't know, the double-edged sword of that is like always that it actually is like bad and depressing in some ways. But that kind of work is exciting in the sense that it helps us understand things that we can hopefully someday do to change how those things work. But I digress, as usual. So what Devine found about stereotype activation and application in a series of 3 studies was that the stereotypes that we have about people are, not just these unique ideas that we have. Like I've talked about already a bit, there is a cultural understanding about what people from different groups are like. They may not be things that we endorse or agree with. In fact, we might very much object to some of the characterizations of people, that people from certain groups are criminal or stupid or intelligent or poor or whatever. We might not want to believe those things, and we might, in fact, know that they're false, but we might still be aware of the cultural association going on between certain groups and certain attributes, and might still have those associations in our minds because of that. So what Devine was working with in these series of studies were beliefs about white and black people, and she divided people up into 2 groups: people that scored high or low on the modern racism scale. High on that scale meaning a high degree of prejudice toward African Americans; low meaning a low degree of prejudice toward African Americans. And she found that people who were high or low in prejudice on this scale didn't differ at all in their knowledge of cultural stereotypes. So, this is kind of a rudimentary test of this, and many, many different replications of this in different domains have happened since then. But this was one of the first pieces of evidence showing, if you're racist or you're not racist, whatever, we all still know the things that we think everyone else believes about these groups. Even if we don't agree with them, we know the content of negative stereotypes about groups. The next thing that Devine showed was, again, that people high or low in prejudice, it doesn't matter. They bring to mind those things spontaneously when you see a member of a group. So in this study, she was showing participants stimuli that included black or white people and having them do tasks that indicated different tendencies, basically. Evaluating different types of behaviors that people were engaging in. And if people had seen black faces, they evaluated those ambiguous behaviors differently than if they had seen white faces. So these people that are high and low on prejudice didn't differ in this. Those things that they brought to mind spontaneously and automatically upon seeing those different people of those different races influenced their perceptions in the same way. Now, to this point, this is kind of depressing, right? That people that are racist or not, you still have negative stereotypes, you still bring them to mind, and you can't help it, basically, to bring them to mind. But the third study did show that even though we all bring these things to mind, if you are motivated to inhibit the application of stereotypes, it's possible to do that. People that are low in prejudice and have a motivation to reduce their prejudice reactions, when they are aware that they're engaging in a stereotyping or discriminatory process, and they have the resources to do something about it, they, under some circumstances, can keep from applying those stereotypes. So, being aware of these processes and trying to do something about them, although not a silver bullet that solves everything, can sometimes be very useful. Now, this is a controversial finding, too, because obviously, people that would describe themselves as not racist and don't want to be racist, or whatever ist you want to put in there, still do racist or prejudicial or discriminatory things, right? So just being aware and not wanting to be that way is not necessarily enough, but in many situations it can help or make a difference. Yeah, I'm going to tie this back to one last thing, and then I'll end this video and move on to the next one. If you think back to the Hilda study that I mentioned in social perception, if you remember, this was one where participants, they read information about a hypothetical partner. They thought it was real, but somebody that they were going to work with on a task, and they were shown a picture of an old woman and told the person's name was Hilda, and they were given this information. Half of it had to do with a stereotype about an elderly woman, half of it was not information that fit that stereotype, and they manipulated the participants' motivation and ability. Motivation in terms of how interdependent they were with Hilda, high motivation being they needed to work together with her to get a payment, low motivation being they'd get paid just based on their own performance, and ability, whether they were cognitively busy or not, having to remember an 8-digit number while they were hearing this information about Hilda. So the researchers just wanted to see, if you remember, what people remembered. And it took, like we've talked about so many times, motivation and ability to do a good job at remembering everything. Everybody remembered stereotype consistent information because everybody has that schema about an old woman when they see Hilda's picture and hear her name. They remember the stuff that fits into their idea of her when they come to the table. But the people that were motivated and able remembered the stereotype inconsistent information too. They were able to look past the stereotypical stuff and remember stuff about this person that was unique and didn't quite fit into those stereotypes. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause there and go on with Prejudice 3.